So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Maria, and thanks a lot for the invitation to give this online seminar today. So I'm going to talk about the dynamics of natural populations under global warming. So we have entered the Anthropocene, as you know, which is characterized by climate change, for instance, global warming, overexploitation of species due to, for instance, fishing or hunting, and habitat destruction due to pollution, for instance. And all these environmental changes are leading to the sixth major extinction event. And as you can see here on this graph, the extinction risk is increasing for all groups of vertebrates, and mammals and birds here make no exception. And so in this context, it is thus important to understand how global changes influence natural populations in the wild, which is a real challenge because multiple environmental factors can interact with each other. And it's also important to detect climate effects at very, very early stages. So today my talk will be divided into three parts. First, overexploitation and climate change are two of the major anthropogenic threats to biodiversity. Potential interactions between harvesting and climate drivers are poorly understood. So this will be the focus of the first part of my talk today. In the second part of the talk, I will illustrate with an empirical case study on reindeer to what extent climate warming and harvest can interact and influence reindeer population dynamics. And finally, in the third and last part, I will introduce the concept of time of emergence to detect early climate signals on natural populations. So let's start with the first part. So first of all, let's focus on the combined effects of climate and harvest on the demography of exploited populations. So we know that climate effects can have strong consequences on population persistence because greater environmentally induced fluctuations in population size could lead to higher extinction risk. But exploited populations are, on top of that, also affected by commercial, recreational, or subsistence harvest, with the removal of some individuals through fishing or hunting. And one question that has been unsolved for some years is, does harvesting amplify the effect of environmental changes on the variability in population size over time and increase extinction risk? So this is what we call the harvest interaction hypothesis. Or alternatively, does harvesting stabilize population dynamics and reduce the extinction risk? So to address this question, what we did is that we reviewed the literature available so far to identify the mechanisms causing fishing or hunting to increase such environmentally induced population fluctuations. So the removal of individuals through harvesting is not random. So if the oldest and largest individuals are preferentially removed from the population, or if harvesting pressure is very high, then the proportion of old individuals in the population will decrease. And in exploited populations of northern cod, for instance, the age structure contained 18 age classes in the 60s, but the older fish disappeared from the population, and the age structure was truncated to 9 age classes more recently. And in fish, the large and the old females are the ones that are able to spawn during different temporal and spatial windows, and they are able to spread the risk of losing all the offspring when the conditions are bad. And so by removing the oldest individuals from the population, age truncation may thus increase the sensitivity of the population dynamics to climate variation. So the northern cod is not an exception. Age truncation is very pervasive in exploited populations. In terrestrial ecosystems, for instance, in ungulates, selective harvest can also lead to such age truncation. And we know that In such long-lived species, young individuals have more variable survival rates over years than adults. And adult survival is kind of canalized or buffered against environmental variation, which is the demographic buffering hypothesis. And so age truncation due to the harvest that removes adults from the population might increase the sensitivity of the population dynamics to climate variation, because the remaining age classes will be the most sensitive to climate variation. So we can wonder, what about empirical evidence in the literature? So there is clearly a growing body of empirical evidence that shows that age truncation might enhance climate sensitivity and generate fluctuations in population size over time. So for instance, in this piece, in this study from long-term data of 6 fish species, the authors showed that high mortality due to fishing is associated with a change in age structure that increases the population susceptibility to extrinsic environmental forcing. And they wrote, our results demonstrate that populations exhibiting a truncation of their age structure were associated with shorter-term fluctuations in time series, which suggest an increased sensitivity to the short-term changes in the environment. This other study here confirmed through modeling and demographic data collected from the literature for 45 fish species that age-selective fishing increases the relative contribution of recruits and thus amplify the destabilizing effect of climate variation. And in this study, the authors wrote that in a variable environment, the addition of mortality from fishing leads to increased temporal variability for all species examined. Similarly, in this study, the author compared the temporal variability of 13 exploited versus 16 unexploited fish populations living in a common environment subject to the exact same environmental fluctuations. And they found that the coefficient of variation of annual abundance was lower in unexploited than in exploited populations. And they concluded that this well-documented mechanism suggests how fishing can make populations more susceptible to extrinsic environmental forcing. Now, if we look at terrestrial studies, the authors experimentally tested the hypothesis of increased fluctuations in population size when the adults or the old individuals are removed using the soil mite as a case study. And they showed that harvesting adults specifically increased population variability, but only in variable environments. And they wrote, only when environmental variation and harvesting were combined did we see strong evidence of magnified fluctuations in abundance. So clearly, through its effect on age structure, harvest may strongly increase the sensitivity of exploited populations to climate variation. But harvest may have other effects on populations. For instance, it can affect spatial distribution. So for instance, empirical work has shown a constriction of geographic distributions associated with harvest pressure, as you can see here. So this change in spatial distribution can strongly weaken the population's abilities to buffer the effects of bad environmental conditions. Populations thus become more vulnerable to climate variability, and fluctuations in population numbers and risk of local extinction might increase. Harvest may also induce what we call spatial synchrony. So for instance, here you can see 3 different populations over time. And when the annual yield is proportional to the population size, then harvest tends to induce spatial synchrony. So basically here, the 3 populations exhibit the same fluctuations in population size over time. And so they are theoretically more prone to extinction because some local patches can go extinct without being rescued by immigration from other populations, for instance. And in this paper, Frank and colleagues showed that the size of 22 populations of cod fluctuate synchronously in the North Atlantic due to the combined effect of climates, but also due to harvesting. So we have seen that harvest can influence age structure, spatial distribution, but it can also influence community dynamics. In marine systems, overfishing of large-bodied fish might reduce herbivory. It can increase the level of disease, and it can prevent the recovery of corals after cyclones. So interactions among species are very important in a community to the resilience of the community. And when some species decline or when some species are removed from the community, interactions are broken. And then the ability of the entire community to recover from disturbances, such as changes in climate conditions, can decrease. So it's really important to understand these interactions. And this has received an increasing interest, actually, in the recent years. Multi-species interactions are now included in models for sustainable harvest of exploited populations. Here, it's a completely different example. So, on the contrary, the removal of carnivores here might lead to high population abundance for ungulates, leading to high herbivory and leading to lower frequency and intensity of wildfires. So in that specific case, we can see that the harvest can be used kind of as a tool to decrease the sensitivity to climate variation. So if we come back to our first question, does harvesting amplify the effects of environmental changes on the variability in population size over time and increase extinction risk? It seems that the answer is yes for marine species. Evidence for the harvest interaction hypothesis is clearly accumulating. However, if we look at terrestrial environments, studies evaluating this harvest interaction hypothesis have mostly developed theoretical approaches to evaluate how contrasting harvesting strategies might increase or decrease environmentally induced fluctuations in population size, but empirical evidence is lacking. So what we did is that we tried to assess whether specific harvest strategies may amplify or decrease the effects of environmental changes on the variability in population size over time using the Svalbard reindeer as a case study. And so this is the second part of my talk that will be dedicated to the test, the empirical test of the harvest interaction hypothesis with the reindeer as a case study. So the Svalbard reindeer population is located in the Arctic, as you can see here on this map. This population has been monitored since decades by capture-recapture protocols, allowing fecundity and survival to be estimated over time. And what we know is that under global warming, winters are expected to become warmer and warmer. And instead of having snow in winter, we expect an increase in the frequency of rain and snow events. So this can have very strong consequences for the reindeer because basically the grass is frozen in the ice, and this reduces the access to food resources for the reindeer. And we have shown that, in particular, the effect of rain and snow can be strong on survival and fecundity probabilities. So what we did is that we projected the population, the reindeer population, under different scenarios of rain and snow events. So we first simulated a scenario with very low frequency and intensity of rain on snow event, as you can see here on this first graph. On the second graph here, you can see the population projected under this scenario of rain and snow. And you can see that there is an increase in population size. And at some point, the population crashes due to strong density dependence. And back to a low population size, then the population tends to increase again before experiencing a new crash due to increased competition for food resources at high population level, and so on. And on the last graph, you can see the projections for future population sizes, but for multiple simulations. Then we simulated a scenario with low frequency and intensity of rain and snow events. So you can see that the population still increases and then decreases in size, but the magnitude of these fluctuations are buffered compared to the first scenario. So this is because the population cannot reach very high population levels due to rain and snow events that decreases the access to food resources. On the third scenario here with medium frequency of rain and snow events, you can see that the magnitude of population fluctuations are lower compared to the previous scenarios. So once again, the population cannot reach high population levels due to rain and snow events that decreases the access to food resources. And so the crashes observed due to strong density dependence regulation do not longer exist. Similarly, with high frequency of rain and snow events, and with very high frequency of rain and snow events, so the population, as you can see here, becomes less and less variable over time. And importantly, even if it's not very clear here on these graphs, we can see that the mean population size, so the average population size, is slightly decreasing from the first to the last scenario. So under global warming, we expect an increase in the frequency of rain and snow events and a decrease to the access to food resources for the reindeer. And this should lead to a decrease in mean population size, but with a stabilized population dynamics kind of buffered against rain and snow events. Okay, so this is for the climate variation part, but what about hunting? What could happen if, on top of that, we include hunting in this population? Does harvesting amplify the effects of environmental changes on the variability in population size over time and increase extinction risk? So we can really test the harvest interaction hypothesis in this system. To do so, we kept 3 climate scenarios of rain and snow event that I showed you earlier. So very low, medium, and a very high frequency of rain and snow events. And on top of that, we added 2 harvest scenarios. So basically, the first one corresponds to proportional harvest, meaning that a fixed proportion of the population is harvested each year. And this proportion varies from 0 to 0.3. And in the second harvest scenario, we considered a constant harvest. So basically, a fixed number of individuals is harvested each year, and this number varies from 0 to 300. And here you can see the scenario of low frequency of rain and snow, and the associated population size, with in blue the population with no harvest at all, and in red the population with a harvest proportion of 0.15. And it seems that adding harvest in the population kind of dampens, buffers fluctuations in population size. If we increase now the frequency of rain and snow events, we observe again the same pattern. And finally, the higher the frequency of rain and snow, you can see that the lower the magnitude of fluctuations in population size, as we have seen before. And interestingly, if we add harvesting, we see that it dampens even more the fluctuations in population size over time. So this means that there is a dampening effect of harvest on fluctuations in population size, because harvest will decrease the population size and will reduce the strength of density dependence. But if we look at the mean population size here as a function of hunting pressure, harvest proportion, or harvest constant, for different rain and snow scenarios corresponding to the solid and the dotted lines, you can see that at some point, whatever the climate scenario, there is a decrease in the mean population size. So it means that high harvest leads to extinction wherever the climate scenario that is considered. So to conclude on this reindeer case study, does harvesting amplify the effect of environmental changes on the variability in population size over time and increase extinction risk? Not always. Harvesting can weaken the effects of density-dependent environmental stochasticity, leading to stabilized population fluctuations and lower extinction risk. But it depends on the timing of harvest, it depends on the harvest pressure, it depends on the species life history strategy, etc. Okay, so let's move to the third and last part of my talk, in which I will introduce the concept of time of emergence to detect early climate signals on age-structured populations. So first of all, a very simple question. What is climate? So climate basically can be characterized by two main components, natural climate variability and climate change. So here, for instance, you can see a climate variable, let's say temperature, over time. And there is here an historical period during which the climate fluctuates, and it corresponds to natural variability in climate. And then here we see that the climate is changing from the historical period. And so this is the climate signal change. And in the climate sciences, this corresponds to the time of emergence in climate. So it has been studied extensively to detect climatic changes, and it corresponds to the point in time when the signal of anthropogenic climate change can be distinguished from noise associated with natural variability in climate. So in natural populations, what happens then is that the climate will influence demographic rates, such as adult survival, juvenile survival, reproduction, with different strength and with different functional relationships that can be linear or can be non-linear. So you can see here, for instance, that each vital rate theta will have its own sensitivity to climate variation. And then the demographic rates will influence the population growth rate. And the population growth rate itself is more or less sensitive to changes in a specific demographic rate, depending on its sensitivity or its elasticity. And as a consequence, any changes in climate may influence demographic rates differently, that in turn influence the population growth rate. And you can see here, for example, that the population growth rate of that population is more or less stable over time until one specific point in time. here. And at this point, the population growth rate decreases due to changes in climate. And so we argue that, as done in climate sciences, we can define this point as the time of emergence for the population. So in population dynamics, this time of emergence in population identifying when the signal of anthropogenic climate change emerges from the noise associated with natural variability. In other words, this is the time at which the population will detectably decline to a lower level below its historical variability. And if the climate change has a positive influence on a population, for instance, this will correspond to the time at which the population will increase to a level above its historical variability. So the question then is, does time of emergence in population depend on species life history strategy? So to address this question, we simulated 4 different life histories based on a very, very simple life cycle, including only 2 stages, juveniles and adults. And for each species, we defined a set of vital rates, annual fertility rate, juvenile survival probability, adult survival probability, and maturation rates. This leads to 4 different life history strategies, going from fast species with a short generation time to slow species with long generation time. And for the 4 different life history strategies, we included the effects of climate acting on only one demographic parameter theta at a time. And in each case, the functional relationship between the demographic rate and the climate covariate was linear, sigmoid, or was a bell-shaped curve function. And then we estimated the time of emergence in climate and in population. So here you can see the results showing the time of emergence in population as a function of time of emergence in climate for 4 different species. And each color here corresponds to one demographic parameter, fecundity, maturation, adult survival, and juvenile survival. So we found that the time of emergence at the population level, as expected, depends on the climate variability and the climate trend. We found that the time of emergence at the population level is linearly and positively correlated to the time of emergence in climate, and that this point in time at the population level depends on species life history. We also found that the type of the functional relationship between climate and demographic rate has little effect on the time of emergence at the population level. So the time of emergence at the population level seems to be an interesting concept to detect climate effects on population size. But then we can wonder, what about the time of emergence for other levels of biological organization? Why? Because fluctuations in population size over time result from interannual changes in demographic rates, such as survival, such as reproduction, such as dispersal. And in turn, changes in demographic rates result from changes in trait values over time, for instance, birth date or laying dates for birds. And these changes in traits are known to have strong consequences on fitness components and then on the population growth rate. So in terms of time of emergence, we can thus make the following prediction. We can expect that the time of emergence should be delayed across the levels of biological organization, occurring earlier for traits than for vital rates and population size. So we tested this prediction using the well-known individual long-term monitoring of the gray-teeth population in the Netherlands that is monitored by Marcel Visser. In this population, laying dates, survival, reproduction, immigration, and population size have been monitored since decades on thousands of individuals. And here, for instance, you can see the laying dates that have been recorded over time in yellow. And you can see that the laying dates are occurring earlier and earlier over time. And what we know is that the laying dates are strongly linked to spring temperatures. And so what we can do is that we can project back in time and in the future the expected laying dates under a scenario of global warming. So this is what you can see here. And under global warming, as expected, we can expect an advance in gray-teeth laying dates over time. So the historical period is defined here with vertical dotted lines. And importantly, the time of emergence can be identified in 2068. So what is important in this system is that the laying dates should match with the date of emergence of caterpillars because it's an important food resource for chicks. And under a scenario of global warming, we found an advance in the date of emergence for caterpillars. And we identified the time of emergence in 2049. So because the date of emergence for caterpillar, as you can see here, is advancing faster than the laying dates, there is a mismatch between laying dates and the date of emergence for caterpillars. In yellow here, you can see the observed mismatch, and in gray and black, you can see the expected mismatch under global warming. So this mismatch is expected to increase over time, but you can see that there is no detectable time of emergence on this trait. And importantly, in the study system, we know that the mismatch may influence in turn some of the vital rates, survival, reproduction, and immigration in this population. But changes in temperatures can influence other environmental factors that are important for the gray-teeth, and in particular, it can influence beech crop production. Beech crop production is an important food resource for gray-teeth, especially during winters. And we know that under global warming, the beech crop production is expected to change in the future. So some of the studies predict a decrease in beech crop production, while some others predict an increase. So in that context, what we did is that we considered two different scenarios, one of increasing and one of decreasing beech crop production to project our gray-teeth population under global warming. To do these projections, we used an age-structured population model, as you can see here. So we considered 4 age classes, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each age class can reproduce and can survive. And importantly, the recruitment strongly depends on the beech crop production and population density. Survival is also age-specific and depends on the beech crop production. And finally, the number of one-year-old immigrants arriving into the population depend on beech crop production, the local population density, and the mismatch. So with those estimated all these different vital rates for the expected conditions of mismatch and beech crop production under global warming. And under a scenario of decreasing beech crop production, you can see that the survival for age class 1, 2, 3, and 4 is expected to decrease over time, as well as for recruitment rates for the 4 different age classes. but it was not possible to detect any time of emergence on these vital rates. Then, if we look at the population level, you can see that we expect to decrease in population size with the time of emergence at the population level estimated in 2069. So it means that we can detect a time of emergence at the population level earlier than for vital rates for those we are not able to detect any time of emergence. So the time of emergence at the population level occurs earlier than the time of emergence at the vital rate level. Now, with the scenario of increasing beech crop production, you can see that survival for all ages here on the first row are increasing over time. And it's the same for the recruitment rate with no detectable time of emergence. And the resulting effect on population size is shown here. So we expect an increase in population size with the time of emergence in 2074, which is again earlier than for the vital rates. So if we come back to our initial prediction, the time of emergence should be delayed across levels of biological organization, occurring earlier for traits than for vital rates and for population size. It's not exactly what we observed in the studied graded population. We found that the time of emergence at the population level occurred earlier than for the vital rates, for which it was not detectable at all. So this is consistent with some previous work that showed that under a fast rate of environmental change and low predictability, a population can decline before any apparent change in the mean value of the trait. We also highlighted that climate trends and variability are differently filtered by the vital rates and by the ages. So basically, some ages are more sensitive to changes in climate than others. And finally, the detection of the time of emergence depends on the level of biological organization considered, its sensitivity to climate, and the amount of variability in the climate and ecological system. So this can have strong implications for our ability to anticipate environmentally induced changes in population size, with important implications, of course, in management and in conservation context. So to conclude, studying population responses to environmental variation is very challenging for several reasons. As we have seen in the first and the second part, several environmental drivers can act simultaneously, leading to complex effects on natural populations. So these demonstrate that accounting for multiple drivers when projecting populations under global warming is very important and is very needed. And as we have seen in the last part of the talk, the signal of climate warming can be detected at different levels of biological organization, from traits to vital rates and population growth rates, at very different points in time. And so this could lead to amplified climate change signal at the population level, with strong and important implications for wildlife conservation and management. So I would like to thank all the co-authors that have been involved in the different studies I show you today. I would like to thank again the organizing committee for this seminar, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marlène. It was really nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a good 15 minutes for questions. Are there any questions? Who wants to start? Yes, John, and then Kara. First, John.
Hi. Can you hear me okay? Sorry, I'm joining on my phone. Thank you so much, Marlène. That was super interesting. So I had a question, just a little more technical question about the time of emergence. At what point, what's the like the definition of the point that you consider the change relative to the background to be met is it based on some uncertainty around the like it seems to be like some based on some confidence level across the population size you like change that, but I just wondered what that was. Sorry if I missed that.
Yeah, thanks, John, for your question. Yeah, it's exactly that. It's based on the confidence interval you can obtain from your historical period. So
Okay.
It's really based on the confidence interval corresponding to the natural climate variability.
Cool. Awesome. And so then something I've been thinking a little bit based on that is you have this sensitivity, the sensitivity and the kind of the demographic buffering that happens within the population. You may assume that like before this like time of emergence is kind of reached, there would be some period where the environmental change is influencing your demographic rates. But that isn't like scaling through to the actual change in population size because there's some buffering process that might be going on there. And I just wondered if you could speak to maybe how you might go about doing that, or like, because that's something I've been thinking that could be quite interesting as like another kind of like demographic early warning signal is like using those sensitivities to kind of maybe predict even before you see that kind of breach, that emergence of the population size, like where then the population might be in trouble beforehand.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Yeah, I have no answer, to be honest. I think we need to perform some simulation studies to really understand. So for the great study system, we really understand what happens. It's clearly an age effect. So all ages are not similarly affected by changes in environmental conditions. And so it's true that if some ages are strongly influenced in environmental changes, but they have a low contribution to the population growth rate, then you cannot really see the results at the population level. So we really understand that in the graded population where different ages are differently affected by environmental conditions. But it would be really great to be able to generalize that for different life history strategies. And I think for this, some simulations are needed. Yeah. Thank you, John.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you, John. Kara also has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks from my side too. I really enjoyed the talk as well. It was really nice. I had a question kind of related to more the harvest interaction hypothesis work. And I was just curious if you could speak to some of the role that maybe like community level interactions may play. Like I was thinking about this buffering that you're saying, I guess, is a result of the impacts on the resource dynamics. But if you had another species that wasn't being harvested that could take advantage of that excess of resources, like how that would influence the results in those cases. And kind of just more generally, I guess, community dynamics and their role with that.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. So again, there is no easy answer to this question. As I showed you with two different examples, one from the marine and one from the terrestrial ecosystem, we see two different responses. So basically, in one case, you remove old and large individuals, and then you increase the sensitivity of the whole community to climate variation. In the other case, if you increase in the case of the carnivores, you just remove these individuals from the population, then you can kind of stabilize the whole community. So it's really community dependent, I would say. And I'm not sure if at this stage we are able to make a generalization of that. So yeah, it shows one important thing is that we clearly need to move from a single species approach to multiple species approach. And yeah, it's obvious that as soon as you remove one population from the community, from harvest or hunting or fishing, then all the relationships are broken and the resilience of the whole community, then it's an important, can have strong consequences for the resilience of the community. So, but it's more and more included into the models for exploited populations. So, I think it's a there are some progress in this field.
Well, thank you. That's very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, could I piggyback with one short question? So related to the time of emergence stuff, you had those like theoretical species. I was curious if those kind of aligned to like a type of species, if you had like fast, slow, and if there was like anything that you could generalize from those more theoretical simulations.
Yeah, so we just simulated 4 different life history strategies. So a very short generation time, I think it was 2 years, so it's comparable to the graded, for instance. And then I think the longest one was 20 years. So then it's more like primates. And we also simulated some more intermediate life history strategies, for instance, ungulates. So yeah, the idea was really to simulate different life history strategies, but of course it's a simplified version. And only 2 age classes have been considered. So maybe, as we just discussed with John, it would be interesting to include some more age classes. So yeah, this is the first step.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also, I don't see any hands raised, but I also have a quick question. So in terms of also for the first part of your presentation, we talk about the differences basically between the marine and the terrestrial systems. There seems to be a very clear pattern of marine systems being where the harvest hypothesis stands, right? Is yes. And why do you think is it so much more complex in terrestrial systems, or versus, or is it what is the why? Why is it so clear in the marine system but not for the terrestrial ones?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't know. If we look at the studies that focused on exploited populations, it's true that in fisheries they have done a lot of things. And in terrestrial environments, we have a lot of theoretical work, but in terms of empirical studies, it's a bit more limited. So clearly, we did the analysis for the reindeer, but it would be very great to do so for other exploited populations in terrestrial environment. And I think the data are available, so we just need to do so.
Do you also think, and I'll get to John just in a second. Do you also think, because I sometimes think that just the type of environmental change is just fundamentally different in marine environments as well as the life histories of species, it seems. So like there is more and more evidence showing that, for instance, in fish species, like all our axes of life history strategies, fast, slow, and their responses don't really seem to hold for the marine environment. You know, is there some maybe fundamental difference in marine environments?
For sure. But I don't think it's a reason why we should not explore this question in terrestrial environments.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, but I agree with you that the pattern will maybe be less clear. And as we have seen on the reindeer, we even found kind of opposite results compared to what has been observed in the marine ecosystems.
John.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry to hog for the. I was going to ask. So, is there when you're considering in the reindeer example, when you considered the harvesting like amounts, did you have is there any sort of age structure to the harvest level, or is that just a raw proportion of the adult population or something like that? Because I just wondered, so some work that I did on black rhino, which was looking at its poaching, poaching, because that's kind of two parts of the question. If you look at a poaching scenario rather than a harvesting scenario with a very vulnerable population, then it can massively increase extinction risk, but only when you've got this kind of like demographic skew, when you know the individuals that are being removed for the population are the ones the sensitive age that is the adult females basically in the population or whatever. So I just wondered whether, particularly in mammals, there's this kind of like the age structure of the harvest scenario that you impose on the population is going to have a big impact on that kind of like synchrony, the like synergy between different drivers of dynamics, or
Yeah, definitely. Selective harvest on specific ages can have strong consequences. Definitely. Yeah.
And how much do you think it relates to kind of like population, like your starting population size? Like, I guess if you're like in the reindeer, it's like a reasonably stable, large population. Whereas if you're then looking at like an endangered population, like the demographic stochasticity from any harvest is kind of just exacerbate the extinction risk even more kind of thing. I just wondered if there's like what that threshold might be.
Yeah. So to address this question, I think we need to do a comparative analysis. It would be Yeah,
definitely. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No. It's a very interesting question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any more questions? Joe,
yeah, I've got a question. Marlène, thanks so much. This is really great. And thinking about that reindeer example, I was surprised because I was expecting with the rain on snow events to make the population fluctuations even greater. And so I was surprised at how much it dampened it. And then with the harvesting also, and I was wondering, thinking about Kara's question about community, when you don't have those large fluctuations of the reindeer population, does that have other impact? I guess I was thinking about it as a good thing versus a bad thing. It seems like having a stable population would be beneficial, but maybe community-wise, having those fluctuations may be more beneficial.
Yeah, so of course, the fluctuations in population size for the reindeer have consequences on the whole community. In particular, it can influence the population dynamics of Arctic fox because they eat reindeer carcasses, and this can also influence geese that are predated by Arctic fox. So there are some cascading effects of these rain and snow events on reindeer, Arctic fox, and geese. So clearly, these huge fluctuations in population size have some consequences for the foxes and the geese. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
That's very interesting. Tom is saying that it was really fascinating. Yes, I agree. It was a very nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Kara has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, hopefully just a quick one. Just on the last results that you presented with the time of emergence, I was just trying to see if I understand correctly in the finding the impact on the population level before the individual vital rates. Is that more due to like noise in those vital rates, or is it more that they're like distributed across the age classes, or like what is it that's making it harder to detect at that level?
Yeah, so in the graph I show you, we included all the uncertainties. So around all the demographic rates, we included everything. So demographic stochasticity, environmental stochasticity, and but we also performed the exact same analysis. So I had no time to show you today, but with simply the effect of climate variation. And in that case, we were able to detect the time of emergence for the vital rates. and it occurred later than for the population size again. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, no, I think. Well, then I would like to thank again Marlène for this wonderful talk.
Thank you
and
very
thank
much,
you all
Maria.
for joining and for the, thank you. Thank you for the many questions. It was a really nice discussion. Thank you so much. And see you all next month.